My name is McDonald. I'm chair of the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology. I'm so excited and in fact honored to be the person who gets to introduce our presenters and authors for today's event. It's important that we begin, as always, with a gesture of appreciation. Appreciation for all the folks that put this event together. Thank you, Michelle, Tony, Elise, Leila. Thanks to the Cook Center. Thank you, Grace. An alum from our department, Grace Donahue. And a quick thanks to the folks at the Cook Center who allowed us use of this space. It's not always that we have been able to schedule our events in a space as beautiful as this, but I'm hoping that we are able to make better use of the space moving forward. It's actually quite an embarrassment of riches to have a space like this dedicated specifically to the humanities and the kind of work that we all do. At times when we often feel down about the university, it's always good to look at these types of things to see all of the amazing resources and opportunities available. That being said, I made Brandon laugh. That being said, this is the end of a long week and a time where we can celebrate a bit and enjoy each other's company and, more importantly, kind of celebrate each other's achievements and the work that we do. What brings us together as a faculty and student cohort is our work. Interests, our inspirations, and the books that we're going to be talking about today are certainly exhibitive of those inspirations. We have 4 excellent texts to take a look at. Among them, you'll notice collaboration, co-authorship, and co-editorship as being a recurring theme. And in addition to that, I'd love to point out the ways in which all of these 4 texts bridge together our institutes and our parallel curricula in really fascinating ways. From there, I think I will close my opening remarks and just say how much I appreciate seeing you all here. And more than anything, I appreciate the fact that we as a department come together in these moments in a spirit of fellowship that many other departments could not muster. So with that, I will introduce our first speaker, Dr. Eduardo Herrera, who will be presenting our first text called, what is it called? At the Crossroads of something or other, who knows? Eduardo, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone. Is the volume okay? Sometimes I speak too loud. Okay. Just tell me. Some of ethnomusicology's most substantive and field-changing work happens in edited volumes. Collections of essays have historically enabled conversations that move the discipline in essential directions, a meeting space that reminds us how, despite the solitude of writing, research is a collective endeavor. Ellen Koskov's Women in Music in Cross-Cultural Perspective in 1987, Helen Meyer's Ethnomusicology and Introduction in 1992, Gregory Barson Tim Cooley's Shadows in the Field in 1997, or more recently, Barson William Chang's Queer in the Field in 2009, and Beverly Diane and Salva L. Shawan Castelo Branco, Transforming Ethnomusicology in 2021, captured and advanced some of the most relevant disciplinary issues of their time. And they demonstrate the intensity and relevance that an edited volume can have for an entire field. It is such a pleasure to present to you all a book that I believe will join this other text among the mandatory readings for graduate students everywhere. The 2023 winner of the Society for Ethnomusicology Prize for a book collection of ethnomusicological essays of exceptional merit, At the Crossroads of Music and Social Justice. Edited by Brenda Romero, Susanna Sy, David McDonald, Andrew Snyder, and Caitlin Best, At the Crossroads of Music and At the Crossroads of Music and Social Justice stands out for blending ethnographies with first-hand accounts from established scholars and aiming for inclusivity and growth in ethnomusicology by mentoring authors with diverse backgrounds and challenges. The volume is an example of political activist projects that it proposes, both of the very political activist projects it proposes, an exercise in truth-telling and listening lovingly, radical inclusivity, coalition building, and direct action, which are precisely the names of the sections that divide the publication. The introduction, subtitled Pathways Towards a Justice-Oriented Ethnomusicology is one of 2 chapters by David McDonald. McDonald's introduction sets the stage for the interventions that take place throughout the volume, which include documenting musical activism, listening closely to historical neglected musical communities, and developing new methodologies born from a commitment to social justice. Without being prescriptive, this introduction invites ethnomusicologists to willingly interrogate, and I quote him, their unrecognized complicity in the systemic violence of the field. McDonald goes as far as to suggest reimagining professional societies as instruments of direct action, institutional spaces of gathering for a collective of activist scholars who use music, thought, and behavior as a means through which to imagine and enact liberatory sound politics, he writes. This thought-provoking introduction not only charts a course towards a justice-oriented ethnomusicological practice, but also orients the reader to understand the following chapters as instances of the steps such practice might take. In the opening section, Truth-Telling and Listening Lovingly, 5 distinguished ethnomusicologists recount their experience, describing how their careers have been shaped by pivotal involvements with social justice. Kira Gaunt, Steve Loza, Brenda Romero, Charlotte Heath, and Paul Austerlitz. Gaunt's narrative works as a platform to underline the mechanisms that operate to reproduce and maintain systems of oppression in academia and professional societies. Loza revisits key moments in his career as an ethnomusicologist to unravel how professional growth in teaching, composing, and research can go hand in hand with a commitment to social justice. Romero, on the other hand, takes her time in weaving stories of success and failure, racism and classism, to reflect on her academic journey, shedding light on systemic biases and advocating for inclusivity and diversity in education. Charlotte Heath's account foregrounds how the sounds and silences of music from indigenous peoples of the United States and Canada are inseparable from the context of exploitation, domination, relocation, and extermination. Yet, Heath highlights the agency of American Indians who adapt, reject, or embrace this musical heritage, which serves not only as a bridge to their past and a voice in contemporary activism, but also as a multifaceted tool for memory, healing, celebration, unity, movement, and reverence. Closing this first part, Paul Austerlitz's chapter illustrates engagement with both music making as a powerful experience and socially engaged research. In his case, the development of a project around altered states of consciousness and the efficacy of music in his own ritual life in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The second part of the volume, Radical Inclusivity, contains chapters that amplify voices, perspectives, and historically marginalized or excluded groups. Caitlin Best argues that paying attention to musical expression in deaf cultures allows us to decenter the oral focus of music studies, revealing gaps in our own understandings of inclusivity. Autism, hearing-centric practices, and the imposing of standards of hearing-able individuals over deaf musical art provoke a sensory bias that wrongfully sees deaf music as something incomplete, she says, or partial experience of music and framed in terms of loss. Katie Graeber's Pink Mennonite hymn sings, Queerness, Inclusivity, and the Mennonite Church questions the assumption that queer Mennonites will want to leave the church because they feel they do not belong. Instead, through Pink Menno, an LGBTQ ally and activist group doing hymn singing, queer folks become visible in public Mennonite spaces, gain a sense of belonging, and underline the need for inclusivity within the denominational structure. In her chapter on the Egyptian independent music scene, Darcy Sprengel argues that Egyptian racial categories are not just a European import, but also an indigenous way of making sense of difference. Yet, quote, they necessarily interact with and are entangled in racialized global structures of power that affect lives of musicians. O Chak Law's chapter, Reclaiming Nanook of the North, documents how Inuk artist Tanya Tagak attempts to counteract the colonial and primitivist gaze of the historic film through her musical mixing of cosmopolitan sensibilities with indigenous practices, thus reclaiming the movie through her sounding, recording body. Closing this second part is David McDonald's Rethinking Popular Culture, Social Justice, and the Compassionate Gaze in Palestine, which uses as its starting point the video for the song If I Could Go Back in Time by Diane, the foremost hip-hop collective in the Arab Middle East. In their video, a woman is killed by her brother and father after trying to escape an arranged marriage. This representation was criticized by Lila Abulugod and Maya Mikdashi for focusing on so-called honor crimes and participating in the reproduction of Orientalist framings of Palestinian women as victims. This, for Abulugod and Mikdashi, is proof that DAM has abandoned its political edge as a protest group. Informed by decades-long relationship with the group, McDonald responds by demonstrating how DAM's attention to the so-called honor crimes is part of their search for new paths of political activism, and that this video and the movie Junction 48, which is streamed in an absolutely fantastic movie, Junction 48, are examples of looking at an intersectional experience of oppression within Palestine, moving away from concentrating on Israel's oppression and instead protesting religious patriarchy, domestic violence, intersectarian relationships, drug abuse, and mass incarceration is, McDonald argues, politics through other means. In a moving interview, DAM singer Tamar Nafar says to McDonald, "So, it is you guys, international audience, scholars, that come in search of protest songs. If protest songs don't exist, that means we don't exist. If the occupation doesn't exist, that means we don't exist. That is romanticizing. And as an artist, I don't like that. After the demonstrations, we Palestinians go home. We pay bills. There is life. What the Israeli occupation is trying to do is dehumanize us and disconnect us from the world. That is why it's important for me to show that we also die from car accidents. We also die from cancer. We find love." Ultimately, McDonald argues that scholars must allow Palestinians and our interlocutors in general the, and I quote, privilege of being non-political, the privilege of vulnerability, and the space to be seen and heard in their own terms. The book's third part, Coalition Building, presents ways music making and music performance can facilitate creating solidarity networks, mobilizing communities to engage in dialogue and generate intercultural exchanges with the goal of social justice. Alexander's chapter showcases... Here we go. Alexandra Carrick's chapter showcases a project in which she facilitated traditional Irish sessions as a meeting space for neurodivergent and neurotypical folks. By taking advantage of the inclusive ethos and welcoming atmosphere of an Irish session, Carrico exemplifies how actively engaging with our research communities and skills as scholars and musicians can help build bridges between diverse populations through collaborative partnerships. The following chapter, by Susan Asai, uses African American and Asian American musical collaborations as examples of coalition building geared towards building solidarity networks, including the cases of Fred Wei-Han Ho, let me say that again, Fred Wei-Han Ho, Yong Yang, Nobuko Miyamoto, and others. Without ignoring the racial tensions and the strategic comparisons that have fueled discord among these groups, Asai demonstrates ways in which individual artists have mobilized Afro-Asian cultural politics towards highlighting their affinity and shared histories of oppression in the United States. The final part of the book, Direct Action, begins with Andrew Snyder's demonstration of how music can serve as a powerful tool for activism through a study of the Brass Liberation Orchestra, a political-driven brass band in the San Francisco Bay Area where Snyder was a member. Through commitment to use, and I quote, music to sustain and support direct action, marches, and social justice organizations, end quote, the Brass Liberation Orchestra participate in a range of political spaces, including immigrant rights, LGBTQIA+ advocacy, anti-gentrification efforts, Black Lives Matter, Occupy movements, anti-fascist actions, anti-war protests, and anti-corporate initiatives. In a brilliant case study at the meeting points of music and environmental justice, Rebecca Moore's chapter is a compelling examination of the cross-continental maritime journey of the Arca Kinari, a ship in which artists blended music, dance, and video art to foster cross-cultural learning and environmental awareness. In a voyage that includes a harrowing experience of being caught at sea for 6 months during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, US-born Great Philistine and Indonesia-born Milva Ruth propose what Moore calls a radical reimagining of the band tour, the concert setting, and climate activism that recollects and activates old knowledge of the sea. Finally, the concluding chapters written by Susan Asai and Brenda Romero serve as a reflective coda, underscoring the purpose and activist intentions behind this anthology. Throughout my reading, I found myself continually drawn back to McDonald's enlightening introduction, where one particular quote resonated deeply and lingered in my thoughts. This is the quote. "Advancing the cause of social justice isn't so much a function of adhering to a set of rules, as it is to adopt critically self-reflexive postures devoted to eliminating the continually emergent injustices inherent to the ethnographic encounter, and interrogating our personal investments in white privilege and supremacy." Congratulations to David and all other collaborators in this project.
Thank you, Eduardo. Usually he makes fun of me. That's the first time he's ever been nice. You read it well. I'm fortunate enough to be the next presenter of Dick's most recent book, with, of course, major contributions by Patrick Feaster. There's a Buddhist parable that I often enjoy contemplating. Maybe you've heard this one before. A monk begins the process of painting the picture of a tiger on the wall of his home. He spends months and months diligently working on the painting, making it ever more realistic, more lifelike. And upon completing the painting, he steps back to admire his work, and the painting instills such a fear in him that a tiger is approaching, he dives for cover behind his bed. It's a simple story meant to teach a lesson. The things we fear are our own creation. Or at least that's what I'm told. But when put into conversation with Dick Bauman's latest book, A Most Valuable Medium, the remediation of oral performance on early commercial recordings published by IU Press, with significant contributions by fellow IU colleague and friend Patrick Feaster, I think this parable takes on additional meaning. I'll give another example. When I teach incoming first-year students about the nature of recorded sound and its impact on the way we conceptualize self and other, I often ask the students a simple question. When you turn your stereo on or when you listen to your earbuds, what are you hearing? Invariably, the students reply, music. I then follow up with a second question. When you gaze at a picture of your grandparents, what do you see? Crickets. Empty stares, bewilderment, sometimes boredom. I continue. Are you gazing upon your actual grandparents? Do you talk to the photo as if you are speaking to your grandparents? Do you expect a response? Of course not, the students collectively reply. The picture is a representation, an image of my grandparents. It would be ridiculous to mistake the image for the real. I then seize the moment. Imagine me standing on the desk, Robin Williams style. But then why do you assume that what you are hearing in your stereo speakers or earbuds is music and not its representation and image? At that point, the students begin to put the pieces together. There's a difference between a phenomenon and its representation, and these differences cue us toward divergent affective response. We take it for granted, especially with regards to recorded sound. we take for granted the many processes of remediation the sonic phenomenon undergoes before it makes it to our ears. It's a representation, it's a photograph, it's not the real thing. Fabian Holt has recently published a provocative book documenting that for today's listener, live music performance is such a rarity that when we say music, we actually mean recorded sound, and that live music now requires adjectival specificity. The relationship has flipped. The photograph has now supplanted the phenomenon. It frames, documents, and records. So Dick's wonderful ethnographic history of recorded sound approaches this exact process from the other end of the spectrum, carefully and beautifully documenting the ways in which folks learned how to engage with recorded sound in their daily lives. I don't see no man's, a bystander on the Lower East Side of New York City responds when we're first encountering a recorded speech of William Randolph Hearst's 1906 gubernatorial campaign. Even the originators of the technology itself, Dick carefully documents, had really no idea what their invention might be. Was it an office tool? A technology of commemoration? Capturing the voices of great men for future generations? Was it a platform for political debate? Expanding the reach and impact of a candidate's campaign? Or was it a gateway for entertainment? Bringing public performance into private spaces? The answer to these questions, as Dick carefully demonstrates, is of course yes, and more. But this book is not merely about the development of new technology. Rather, this book is about processes of remediation and meaning-making, the creative, improvisatory, and perhaps serendipitous mechanics behind taking a riveting oral performance based on human co-presence and rapt engagement and preserving qualities of that public performance in a mediated format, limited only to sound and lasting a maximum of 3 minutes, listened to by individuals in the privacy of their homes. Through remediation, Dick has provided us a fascinating historical ethnography of early commercial sound recordings in the United States. Centered around the formative years of 1895 to 1920, we not only learn what performers of spoken word did to adjust their craft to the constraints of the new medium, we also are afforded the opportunity to observe how this medium concomitantly reshaped its listeners. Dick dwells in the nuance of a historical moment of great possibility, contingency, and plasticity, allowing his readers to witness the birth and development of a recorded sound in public and private spaces, but also, and perhaps more important, I would argue, we learn about how that medium created new forms of assembly, new publics, new forms of community and connection. The chapters are organized by genre, beginning with the remediation of political oratory, moving then to oral blackface, parody performances, country storytelling, and country music. Through these case studies, we are introduced to an array of performance artists whom I have never experienced before. George Graham, Bert Williams, Cal Stewart, Charles Ross Taggart, and many others, all of whose fame have, at least in my experience, withered into history. The words of these performers are dutifully transcribed and analyzed with clarity, insight, and critical attention to larger power dynamics. These transcriptions, and the book is replete with beautiful transcriptions, are buttressed with the actual recordings, curated in a detailed discography assembled by Patrick Easter. This book teaches of sound, and then it invites the listener and the reader to indulge. Chapter 2's presentation of recorded parodies of church sermons from the blackface minstrel show tradition, for example, become opportunities to critically analyze U.S. racial politics at the turn of the 20th century. It's not just the white performers, however, that draw our attention. Rather, Dick engages through comparison with the subtle yet divergent poetics of African-American parody by black performers as well, connecting oral performance with internally constructed notions of the new Negro in dialogical conversation with the sounds of white supremacy. Chapter 4 takes a similar approach, documenting the aesthetics of country nostalgia and the cultivation and commoditization of rural practice at a time of rapid urbanization. Sound entices the listener to experience the other for a small fee. And for those in the room today, my beautiful colleagues with me today, Those interested in oral performance, poetics, and narrative, this book does not disappoint. It raises deep theoretical questions about remediation, but it applies its arguments most clearly and definitively in the messiness of sonic engagement. All of that is to say, what Dick does is he brings us back to that same story, but it's not merely about trying to document the ways in which technology forces upon us or compels new approaches, but more important, the way in which it fills the gaps. And this is where that last chapter becomes my favorite. I'm biased, of course, as an ethnomusicologist, but the last chapter attends directly to this argument about schizophrenia. All of the master's students in the room will know exactly what I mean when I say schizophrenia. It's a long, enduring conversation in ethnomusicology. What happens when sounds get disembodied from their sources? And then what does that mean for the sonic encounters that emerge? In this particular chapter, I'm absolutely inspired. Because more than anything, Dick is pointing out that the ways in which folks remediated their approach to recorded sound in an attempt to try and bridge that gap, the gap between time and space, the gap between the immediate and the recorded, the gap between the distant and the near. In attempting to bridge that gap, we find out what's really going on. And this is where my main interest comes from this text, because it designates us as a diagnostic, in fact, that in bridging the gap, in this remediation process, we're not really talking about technology at all. What we're talking about is connection, or at least the desire to rebuild that connection, to bridge those gaps of time and space and connection. And that's where I find this work really fascinating, because we find, just like the monk, right? Just like the monk who's scared in his own picture that he created, just as I often tear up every time Don't Stop Believing comes on my Spotify. Just as I often also tear up every time I see a picture of a departed friend that I have hanging in my office. And just as the interlocutors in this text demonstrate that what's really going on with sound and with remediation is the desire to piece back together feelings of safety, belonging, and connection that we get through sounded performance and embodiment. Dick artfully and skillfully points us to these directions and how it happened at a turning point in technological innovation in our nation's history. And I would point out that these same conversations are currently taking place with AI, in the sense that now there are AI bots that can fulfill emotional, affective relationships in people's lives. Brandon's yelling at me right now. He's got more to say on this. Then we are willing to fully understand, and just as these folks are crumbling in their minds to understand how they are hearing these sounds but not seeing a person in front of them, we are at that same moment in our engagement with artificial intelligence and the affective responses that it remediates for the same purposes. For those willing to swim in these waters, Dick gives us an excellent sojourn, an excellent rapids to traverse. And we are left for the better for it. Thank you so much for this text, Dick. Congratulations. With his rebuttal.
So, no, you're going to find here in a second that I totally agree with you. Yes.
When you agree with Brandon, you know you're right. With his amazing rebuttal, I now invite Brandon Barker to the stage. The floor is his to present our next book, Folk Art, Continuity, Creativity, and the Brazilian Quotidian, co-authored by our dear colleagues and friends, Glassie and Pravina.
So I agree with Dave in like a lot of what's going on today. The first place I agree with him is that I love these events. And I love them because we get to look inward, we get to celebrate each other. And so congratulations, Dick, congratulations, Diane, congratulations, Bill, congratulations, Pravina, congratulations, Henry, congratulations, Dave. This is like some of my favorite days of the semester. So, of course, this is a great and weighty honor for me to get to speak about Pravina and Henry's new book, Folk Art, Continuity, Creativity, and the Brazilian Quotidian. I admit, a part of me wants to say that the book is just simply another masterpiece. Big surprise. Now, like, go read it. But another part wants to say it anyway. And it's the same part that always feels inspired by Pravina. It's the part resting next to your admiration for your colleagues. It's the part next to your love for your friends. You see, you get your copy of the book in, say, the middle of last year, and you know as soon as you pick it up that it is indeed a book of Pravina and Henry's making. 612 pages, 549 colored photos, and one clean hand-drawn map. It's too good to be true, of course, but you're also convinced that yet another book is actually here when you check the press releases and find early consequential recommendations. Look at Indiana University Press's website. There you'll find high praise, for example, from renowned folklorist of the American South, Ferris. Here's an excerpt from Ferris's blurb. When considering folk art, continuity, creativity in the Brazilian quotidian, there are no words adequate to describe it. The unadorned clarity of both the author's narrative and that of the artists with whom they worked in Brazil is absolutely stunning. This is a book for the ages that places folk art and the artists who create and nurture it at the center of life itself. Okay, now, Ferris isn't wrong, but it isn't lost on me that he's saying there's no words to describe a book that I'm up here having to give you a speech about. But still, you keep going. This being our era, you also look at the book's page on the Amazon website. I admit it, I did. For better or worse, there are no additional daunting blurbs. But strangely, you notice that Amazon reports that the book weighs 1.47 pounds. Wait, you say. That can't be right. You're familiar with the problem of size weight illusions, and you sure don't want anyone else, especially Amazon, telling you what to think about a book written by masters in your own discipline. So you do what anyone else would do. You take the book and you put it on your own scales. 3.83 pounds. Thanks for nothing, Amazon. Now, I don't want to digress, but the perception of heaviness is a fickle affair. So much depends upon the lifter's condition, whether or not you've eaten that day, whether or not you've slept, whether or not you've been doing the exercises the doctor told you to do. That is, as to heaviness, as with our other senses, absolutes mean nothing. Contexts, and not a small amount of offline cognitive processing, give rise to the top-down, bottom-up blend that is perception. More to the point, and more toward the human experience, weight accrues in books written by Henry and Pravina, not in relationship to the relative density of the book's materials. There's little to do with complicated computational problems associated with the adequate grip force and enhancing dust jacket's tendency to slip. No concerns with paper or hardback. It is not really even the number of pages. No, in Glassie and Shukla's existential ethnographies, weight functions at the level of the line. After line, after line, after line of empirical data, gathered in the field while learning, in this instance, from traditional artists in Brazil's northeast, especially in the state of Pernambuco. The book opens with a short welcome and a description of Pernambuco's geography. Pravina and Henry tell you in the first paragraph that in the hilly areas in the vicinity of Caruaru, the prime city of Pernambuco's interior, they say, there are so many dedicated artists busily at work that we are not obliged to make much out of little, relying on speculative interpretations of antique artifacts or contriving abstract arguments and theories. We can proceed empirically, talking with people, watching them work, and letting them lead. Our aim is not to study them, but to stand with them in mutual appreciation of their creations. And so, tossing aside unnecessary theoretical baggage, the intro proves retroactive. When you were reminded that Pravina and Henry began field art in 2007, folk art, in fact, is the second book to come from their work in South America. And in 2018, when Henry and Pravina published the first book, Sacred Art, Catholic Saints, and Candomblé Gods in Modern Brazil, the pair returned, as they put it, with overweight suitcases crammed with books to give copies to all of the 2 heads eastward to Viseros and is dedicated to artists making woodblock prints in Viseros and along the coast in Olinda. In part 3, Glassie and Shukla gather their experiences of ethnographic fieldwork on 5 continents as they describe the long road to strong inference that carries them toward their grand folk art theory as a biologically manifest, culturally realized characteristic of our species, of humankind. On this long road, the folk artists in Brazil are situated at the spot where the demand for utilitarian pottery declines, where the people who could work clay found inspiration in the strong Brazilian carving tradition that provided and provides ample opportunities for artists working in clay to admire polychrome wooden saints in Brazilian churches, and then to make clay figures of Lampia, Los Retirantes, and the rest. This spot is worth a pause, and I want to tell you about my experience of the first time that I saw this spot. You see, you devour the introduction, and then read and read because the writing is so clean and the people you learn about teach so well. You put your daughters to bed, you trade a little sleep, and you read some more, learning more right alongside the ethnographers. I borrow the phrase, long road to strong inference, from my friend and another important source of intellectual inspiration, comparative psychologist and chimpanzee expert Diane. Diane, like Henry and Pravina, understands that humans are both radically same as other animals in our kingdom and radically different. Moreover, the human tendency for taking the intentional stance and our general inclination toward anthropomorphism mean that one-off anecdotal evidence or trendy experimental findings evincing a smooth mental continuity across species is always precarious, unreliable. Note the parallelism between anthropomorphism and ethnocentrism. To avoid these traps, to suss out similarities and differences, you have to head down the long road of strong inference. You see, you are on page 487 of folk art, at the end of a comparative analysis of art on 5 continents, at the end of the chapter's concluding section called Art of a Figurative Form, when Henry and Pravina explain, the story ends where it began. There is no better example of the shift to the figurative when utilitarian demand declined than Alta de Mora. Obviously, cycles are not unheard of in folklore studies, but questions in which the answer is offered in the asking always leave me wondering about what comes next. Next, Pravina and Henry Millar. This is really good. The chapter's logic would locate Alta de Mora right here. So the best, though highly improbable thing for you to do is to treat this book so far as a circular narrative, returning to the beginning and reading straight through until you reach this point again, before turning to the next chapter. I recognize the mic drop moment. I set down the book, full of nerves. I laughed. You see, in June, you are lost in the hallucination that the summer will never end. You have the time. You could go back to the beginning. But then you zoom out and you think about the disappearing length of the long road to strong inference. And you ask yourself, my God, does this mean I need to read the Grace of 4 Moons? Passing the time, costume, Turkish traditional art today? This time, from mind to body, you feel the weight of so much empirical data. You close the book. No need for a bookmark. You're on page 487. You sleep, and you do not fret. In part 1 in Alta de Mora, the clay sculptors cite their predecessor and originator of local forms, Master Brillhart, a countryman who, born in 1909, moved to Alta de Mora in 1948 and became famous for making clay images of northeastern rural life. The first artist we seek at work in folk art is the 4th child of Master Brillhart, named Severino Brillhart, who is sitting cross-legged, working on a clay figure on the floor of the Museum of Master Brillhart. From Severino, you learn the standard types and tokens of Master Brillhart's in the area's repertoire: the bull, the hunter of the margay pointing his gun up at a treated wildcat, Los Retirantes showing a line of people and domestic animals escaping drought in the northeast, Severino's fishermen. There are also music-themed pieces, to Dave's good point, that depict northeastern trios featuring accordion and bands of five-flat pipano musicians, performing alongside drummers and triangle players. The important regional music associated with these scenes is the innovative country music Fojo, and Fojo's hero is Luis Gonzaga, described as a cognate to American country music's Bill Monroe. Gonzaga is also often represented in play, playing the accordion. But the most frequently portrayed figure in Alta de Mora is Take from the Rich, Give to the Poor hero Lambio and his beloved comrade Maria Bonita. In these early chapters, as you learn increasingly more about the people who make the art, about the repertoires, several of the book's underlying themes are established. Severino explains that the rural Brazilian life depicted by pieces like The Fisherman and The Retreat from the Field is the quotidian referred to in folk art subtitle. As for art, the species-specific and species-general want for creativity takes local artists' name, Dome. Severino teaches the ethnographers as they teach us. Dome is a gift from God. More than a gift of innate talent, it is a gift to the will that draws people into creation. Master Berlino had a dome, Severino too. 16 additional chapters in Part 1 teach about an increasing number of artists, maintaining tradition, and expanding repertoire. Once in Becheros, in Part 2, woodblock print artists become the teachers. Upon first arrival, you learn that the woodcutter's historical analog to Master Berlino is J. Borges. You get to visit with Henry and Pravina, J. Borges' big shop up on the hill, and see the impressive array of woodblock imagery appearing on everything from frameable prints to chapbooks, tiles, tote bags, notebooks, and magnets. There is continuity with the clay in Alta de Mora. Lambio and Maria, for example, are stars in Becheros too. And there are welcome transformations. In Alta de Mora, Lambio and Maria stand front-facing as saints, but Becheros, in the hands of woodblock carver J. Miguel, the lovers face each other and still a kiss. You learn the significance of the fact that while woodcutters in Becheros create images of Our Lady and the saints, they also realize Brazil's syncretic function of African and Catholic beliefs by creating images of candomblé wishes, such as the sea goddess Iemanjá, presented as a mermaid in both J. Borges's and J. Miguel's repertoires. A striking episode of the Shadows comes just about 1.5 years after the COVID outbreak. There's a lot of connections there. And what I mean by that is, by that time, Pravina and Henry were back at work, back in the field. Their view of the pandemic is ground level. You learn of J. Borges' struggles with depression while being stuck in the house during COVID. You put faces and names to the psychological trauma of the pandemic's dreadful isolation. Jamilson caught the virus and lost his sense of taste. Marietta vaccinated twice and ran errands for the elders. But then you also get details about the artist's worlds coming back to life. Imprinted in your mind is a picture of a sign on the door of Luis Carlos' shop. It reads, "Come in with a mask. Thanks." In 2020, J. Borges presented on television a poetic text responding to the pandemic. Fluent in Portuguese, Pravina's translation into English appears at the beginning of chapter 23. Here are a few lines. "There is no cure, no remedy, and the whole world is blasted. And the doctors recommend for us to stay home. It has been 2 weeks since I closed the atelier. I keep waiting for good news to appear. There has to be some exit to prevent the world's death." I wonder, how many of us have stories from the field about what it was like during the COVID shutdown? J. Borges' poetry brings back, once again, notions of shared human experience. 2 pages before the start of Part 3, you see a picture of J. Miguel, masked, carving an image of Adam and Eve. Part 3's layout of the aforementioned grand theory of folk art turns towards the universal, as Henry has in the past via Noam Chomsky. And Noam Chomsky's theories, generative grammar, the association makes perfect sense. Chomsky's mid-20th century reproach of the behaviorist's refusal to accept the causal actualities of the human mind align perfectly with Pravina and Henry's theories about the intentional and unintentional choices that artists make when they, one, choose to create, and two, give life to the creative ideas in their heads. Chapter 24 begins, the mind capable of art is the mind capable of language. That mind is our universally human dome. Hitting upon the interplay of infinite possibilities arising from finite sets and coupling that interplay seamlessly with Heinz's performance theory. The chapters in part 3 revisit the art in the minds of the people you remember from previous works. Joseph and Peter Flanagan in Ireland, Ahmed Shaheen in Turkey, Wanda Aragon in Akama, Harapata Paul in Bangladesh, many, many more. That is, while the theory is grand and cross-cultural, it also demands for individuals to rise to a level of importance and become a focal center. And so here at the end, there's good cause to bring 2 more individual artists into my concluding frame. In part 1, and I'll do tomorrow, chapter 14 focuses on the life and work of Luis Antonio and his wife, Odette. Luis Antonio is a sculptor of clay, and Odette is a painter and occasional sculptor. I have my own idiosyncratic reasons, but my favorite pieces of art in the book are the statues, a heroic lineman created by Luis Antonio. The statues present a lineman sitting atop, triumphantly atop utility poles, working the lines that bring the electricity. As working heroes of the modern day, the linemen fit easily into Luis Antonio's repertoire, as he also makes playful clay figures of cars, people taking pictures with modern cameras, and even a figure of a woman seated at a desk working on a digital computer. It is the realness of this fake computer folk art that I close with. The lines of the desk and monitor are imperfectly natural. They report immediately and obviously that the piece has been made by hand. What a statement. You see, you know when you look at the picture of the figure called Working at the Computer, 17 meters long, made by Luis Antonio in 2015, that this piece of art is real. You grinned when Pravina and Henry explained that the blocky, old-fashioned desktop maintains Luis Antonio's first visions for the piece that came into formation in 1995. Remember computers back in 1995? As computers got smaller and slicker, the authors tell us he held to his own image, so his depiction of the new transformed into a depiction of the old, a bit of postmodern nostalgia. So finally, you learn that mental imagery matters to Luis Antonio. Stopping technological progress in 1995, the artist captures perfectly so many of your worries that technologists will not stop until they have completed their reverse engineering of humankind's intentional and cognitive systems with direct upshots towards the creation of a simulacrum of the human mind so convincing in its illusory powers that we can no longer tell the difference between reality and unreality, or that we will not care about the difference between reality and unreality. And then again, to folklore's great benefit, Professor Shukla and Professor Glassie's new book reminds you, once again, that we folklorists do have ways of keeping a grasp on out in the world reality. Folk art demonstrates in clear methodological and ethical terms the inherent value of existential ethnography, of folkloristic fieldwork. Thank you, Henry and Pravina, for keeping the reality of Northeast Brazilian folk artists so clearly present in our minds.
Hold for a moment. Pause for a hug. Thank you, Brandon. So, our last and final book, which our dear friend Daniel will be presenting forthwith, is an interesting co-edited collaboration amongst senior faculty and some of our best graduate students from both folklore and ethnomusicology. I'll leave it to Daniel to bring us up to speed on Behind the Mask, vernacular culture in the time of COVID, edited by Ben Bridges, Ross Brillhart, and Diane Goldstein. Daniel. Thank
Well, I've been asked to speak about Behind the Mask, vernacular culture in the time of COVID. The latest in a long and admirable tradition that distinguishes our department, that of timely and significant edited volumes produced by some combination of faculty, graduates of our programs, current graduate students, and even collaborations between faculty and graduate students. Behind the Mask falls in that latter category. It is edited by Diane Goldstein, folklore professor at Herrera, grad student, soon to be assistant professor of folklore at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Ben Bridges, and grad student, now program manager at the Divided Sky Foundation, Ross Brillhart. So I'd like to begin by drawing special attention to how laudable that is. An eminent late career folklorist collaborating with 2 graduate students, editing a significant scholarly work for a major university press. This is far from unprecedented in our department, and for this we should be proud. I'm going to start by applauding the theory of the work. That's great. These 3 scholars are both editors and authors of the incisive introduction of the volume. Because Bridges, Brillhart, and Goldstein sounds like the name of a law firm, I will hereafter refer to them as BBG. Not to be confused with a radio station or a bagel shop. Behind the Mask grew out of a COVID-19 interest group in our department that began fittingly with bi-weekly meetings on Zoom during the early days of the pandemic. In the excellent introduction, BBG placed this book's mission in historical context, asserting that the vernacular responses of regular people are missing from our histories of previous pandemics, such as the plague and the Spanish flu. Now with COVID-19, they write, we offer a look behind the mask at the vernacular culture affected or inspired by the pandemic. Lest one assume that the concept of the vernacular might seem to limit an effort to better understand responses to a pandemic in the globalized 21st century, the authors demonstrate otherwise. In this book, they conceive of the vernacular as fluid and adaptable, place-based but not bound, a venue through which agents adapt cultural resources to their life needs, a vernacular that is, quote, flexible, dynamic, multi-sourced, and global. As they say, folklorists love 3s. I've already mentioned that this book has 3 editors. The volume is organized in 3 sections, according to 3 productive themes, and each section has, you guessed it, 3 chapters. Section 1, the vernacular to the rescue, community, creativity, and coping with COVID-19, but again, 3 post-foci, sheds light on the effectiveness of vernacular practice as a means of dealing with crisis. Its 3 chapters address what people did when finding themselves in the existentially ambiguous, isolating experience that we all surely remember well, an experience the editors characterize as liminality, a variable Van Genneppian period of social limbo. In my remaining time, I'll highlight 3 chapters, one from each of the 3 sections, to lift up as particularly stellar examples of the study of vernacular culture as a tool to understand COVID. They also happen to be chapters written by current and or former members of our departmental community. As one of many whose home regularly filled with the comforting aroma of home-baked bread during the pandemic, I had a warm reaction to needing comfort, community, and craftsmanship, baking in the coronavirus by Lacey Long and Teresa Vaughn. Teresa Vaughn being an IU folklore PhD, graduate student colleague of mine, now professor and dean of humanities at the University of Central Oklahoma. Focusing on social practice, especially on social media, Long and Vaughn demonstrate that, well, the bread was baking, identities and communities were in the making. They argue persuasively that fresh-baked bread's reputation as comfort food served as an antidote to the fear and uncertainty of the pandemic days filled with feelings of deprivation. Vernacular bread making, they offered, was a hedonistic response of sensory indulgence, an interpretation supported by the frequent postings by bakers on social media of sentiments such as the proverb, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die. The authors also note that bread making embodies a note of nostalgia for many, a longing for a past time before bread was mass-produced and sold in plastic bags in supermarkets. This despite the fact that for many pandemic makers, baking bread nostalgia was more connected to imagined, romanticized pasts than to the realities of individual histories. While people's bodies baked and consumed bread at home, they shared the experience online, creating our author's second theme, community. Long and Vaughn document the emergence of a whole new bread-making communities, as well as pre-existing communities, turning their online communication and purpose toward bread-making. I found particularly interesting old-time musician Bruce Malsky's Facebook page entitled Fiddle and Dough, a private site for those interested in the vernacular that encompasses both music and food. Sharing of recipes, techniques, and tips is not just a means of community cultivation, but also a form for advancing one's skills, bringing us to the author's third theme of craftsmanship. Long and Vaughn draw in material culture scholars Henry Glassie, Pravina, Shukla, Michael Owen Jones, and others. They discuss three areas involved in the making of things: the materials, the tools, and the techniques for using those tools and those materials. Using direct first-person quotes from interviews and social media posts, this section of the chapter succeeds beautifully in representing the art and craft of pandemic bread making, highlighting the mastery of making bread such as those elevated to the aesthetic status of artisanal. The authors convincingly demonstrate that pandemic bread makers were not just loafing around. Section 2, the failure of experts and the rise of vernacular expertise, turns the pages of this volume toward a very different dimension of the cultural response to COVID. My favorite chapter here, by our own Diane is Beyond Bat Eating, Digital Discourses of Zoonotic Disease in the COVID-19 Era. It offers a skillful interweaving of ethnography with theory from cultural geography, science and technology studies, and critical animal studies, resulting in a richly innovative approach to the understanding of pandemic experience. Julian's argument has, guess how many? 3 and another couple aside. Songs about bat consumption as sites for the expression of disease narratives that, quote, thinly mask racist assumptions, connecting prevalent cultural attitudes about bats with ideologies of race. 2, critiques of food practices that operationalize xenophobic, cultural imperialistic discourse, placing blame for the COVID-19 pandemic on China. And 3, transfer of bat soup rumors into bat soup songs, which occupy an uncomfortable place between disease prevention and political scapegoating. Reading Julian's chapter is fun, and both fun and troubling, as it spotlights quirky, bizarre expressions of human creativity that made me laugh and then feel disturbed that I would have done so. Because the racist attitudes and actions against Asians and Asian Americans behind the mask of bat soup songs are no laughing matter. Section 3, When Vernaculars Meet, offers 3 chapters exploring how people's enactments of creative agency in response to the pandemic crossed or blurred boundaries between expressive genres. Expressive vernaculars, sorry. The chapter Zoom, the creation of virtual space, culture, and community during the pandemic through digitized platforms, was written by Kinsey Brooke, at the time of writing a graduate student in our department, who is now working in academic advising at the University of Georgia. As the title suggests, this chapter looks at the effect of social distancing on cultural and arts agencies that, until COVID, relied heavily on in-person interaction. Members of our community will recall 2020 as the year of the online everything, including our classes, lectures, the Lotus Festival, SEM and AFS conferences, the live music performance being streamed by a new local company called Mandolin and Arnold. Kinsey's chapter discusses how cultural and arts agencies used virtual space to promote folk life and public arts programming, not, as in pre-pandemic times, as an optional means of outreach and extension, but rather as their only option for cultural programming. The implications of this shift were many, but included increasing access and opportunities for modes of expression, practice, and learning. Focusing on 2 case studies, the Newfoundland and Labrador Folk Arts Society and the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, Kinsey effectively argues that virtual space, as a substitute for face-to-face public folklore experience, became itself a space for vernacular socialization, learning, and community building. Our disciplinary toolkits afford us special insight into the dynamic dialectical relationships between individual agents and community convention that render vernacular cultural practice such an illuminating subject. Who better to get at the heart of debates and divisions over the politics of masking up? Who better to tease out the social processes engaged in individual expressions of freedom versus notions of the common good? In the words of BBG, who better to help us understand, quote, pandemic memory as embodied, not just in the sense of the ways that the disease itself interfered with bodily function, but in terms of how we all experienced the pandemic through our bodies. What did it mean to have a body during COVID? How did our bodies work together while not in physical proximity? How did we co-create physically distant space? How did smell, sound, or sight change in building spaces that were now empty? Behind the Mask demonstrates beautifully that folklorists, ethnomusicologists, and our sister and brethren possess the methodological and theoretical tools, the deep specificity of ethnographic focus, along with a comparative perspective that perfectly positions us to shed light on the relationships between social crisis and cultural practice. Please join me in congratulating Ben, Ross, and Diane, the rest of the authors.
Congratulations. Thank you to all of our presenters today for a spirited and lively and engaging look into some of the work of our faculty and students. With that, I thank you all for coming and invite you to please enjoy the rest of the evening and all of its bounty. And hopefully we'll have this event again soon with a new crop of books.